In Act 1, the robbery, with Cafe, Sakon, Weissen, the old lady from the bomb shop, and the town guard. In Act 2, off to the valley, with the salesman, Cafe and Sakon. And in Act 3, the milk bar Brindisi, with the clock towners.
So most of what I listened to from Act 3, I've only listened to it once, apart from Pamela's Ariete, which is demo number 3, I think. So I really don't have any favorites from that act yet. Act 2, however, is very easy for me. It's Cafe's dream, no doubt about it. I still remember the first time Miguel showed it to me when we were both still at the music academy. And I remember he had just written it and showed it to me and told me it was a dance number. I thought it was amazing from start to finish. I think it's probably my favorite thing, not only from this act, but also from all the things Miguel has done so far. Act 1 is hard, many good moments, many moments I really like, but when I want to show people something from the opera, I always end up thinking, I really have to show them Majora's aria because it's really where the heart of the opera is. And to me, it's the moment that defines this whole work. First time I heard it, I thought it was absolutely crazy. And the more I listen to it, the more I love how crazy it actually sounds and how crazy the character is.
For me, in the first act, the Giant's Lament with Cafe, the Giant, and the Deku. From the third act, the Death Quartet with Cafe, Pamela, the Happy Mask Salesman, and Sharp. Act 2 is tricky because I like the entire passage from Red Sea with Cafe and Mikau right through to Anju's Lament. It's all glorious.
I am currently working on music for a visual novel called Hand of Rosacea, and I've written music for a short game that wasn't finished on time for the Game Boy Game Jam of last week. When the game is out, I'll gladly release the soundtrack. They are, but the revision levels at which we operate right now are fragmented into tasks which are impossible to sum up on a progress bar that spans a section as large as an entire act, given that we work with layers of back and forth checking and rechecking as we revise. In fact, the more we realize what had to be done, the more we honed our process so that nothing is left behind. Liam helped us organize this mess, and therefore be more aware of at what phase each subsection is. Because the acts are split into separate score files, to prevent long loading times for small corrections, I've replaced the progress bars with a more detailed revisions chart. This is basically a simplified view of the system Liam came up with, and which we follow in the repository we share. I thought it would be good for people to be aware of our progress through a more detailed chart than the old progress bars, but not through something as messy as the list of issues we dump into GitHub's bug tracker for each other. I intend to update it every week and skip only those that have substantial inactivity.
Then current Arch Linux with KDE 5. The desktop theme is Ghost by JM Todaro, and the terminal emulator pictured is Swordfish 90's cool retro term with a full Artesque preset I set up myself. I have, for practicality's sake, replaced CRT with Yakuake, though I still have it for when the mood arises. The acts of composition and performance in Western music, especially opera, often have very different concerns and require different skill sets. Where a composer is usually interested in possibility, a performer will usually be interested in practicality. Reconciling these opposing forces is one part of the science known as orchestration, which is to music as rhetoric to language. A symphony orchestra is a very large and varied ensemble, and each one of its many components have many idiosyncrasies and caveats, as well as unique characters and effects they can lend to the whole ensemble. There are many ways to study orchestration, and most will begin with an organologic approach, a catalogue of instruments and a study of each one's capabilities. This is the approach of the Grand Treatise on Orchestration by Hector Berlioz, and of the more contemporary study of orchestration by Samuel Adler. These are excellent theoretical texts outlining possibilities and a good deal of expectations, and we have and do indeed refer to them occasionally if in doubt. However, theory has limits, and we have since learned to be slightly mistrustful of any singular resource on orchestration that claims to be comprehensive. This is less the fault of texts such as Berlioz and Adler, and more a simple consequence of the fact that at least Western music is several centuries old, and its aesthetics, instruments, and practices have evolved all over the world over the course of its history, often bearing little resemblance to its origins. For example, as many as a dozen different transpositions of clarinet were available in Berlioz's day, but nowadays the B-flat instrument is almost universal, and I have seen an E-flat clarinet exactly once in my whole life. The different instruments made it easier to play in certain keys, a difficulty the keying system of the modern instrument substantially obviated, and lent slightly different timbral characteristics, particularly brightness, that are now almost never considered. Another example, the evolution of the piano to become a longer sustaining instrument to the point of the addition of its characteristic pedal, utterly changed the idiom of the instrument, and the performance of historical works on modern pianos often entails a substantial degree of adaptation. The ubiquitization of equal temperament and pitch standardization also dramatically changed the sound of many orchestras and instruments alike, and pose complications for some instruments whose intonation is highly tied to overtones, which do not easily lend to such tempering without various compensatory mechanisms. For example, thrown slides in valved brass. Far easier for a brass choir to play in a key that agrees well with their instruments than in arbitrary equal-tempered chromaticism. Performance practice has also evolved considerably independently of instrumentation. The interpretation of accents and percussion, in your example, is one case of this. I've always read the marking called tenuto as the weakest of three kinds of accent, the strongest of which is called marcato and implies a strong attack. Almost every non-percussionist I have spoken to interprets tenuto as something like a lingering, by its inane, apparent definition, to play the note for its full length, and marcato is less about attack and more about a shortening, a trait that I would be rather more inclined to mark with the addition of staccato, or, especially on timpani, literally just shortening the notes. As an aside, the literalness with which a timpanist ought to play note durations at all is a fascinating study in madness and pedantry. Another is the accasciatura-appoggiatura distinction. While there is a good agreement that one occurs in anticipation of the beat and one immediately thereafter, which is which seems to depend on who you ask and what era they are from, and many contemporary musicians do not even understand there to be a distinction, or even two of them. Earlier this year, we raised the example of a mordant as an ornament that has also evolved in its interpretation to the point that there is likewise little clear consensus. Even Berlioz and Adler disagree on many points on account of their differing places in history. We three musicians, Bulto, Jesus, and I, even disagree on several points of theory and notation ourselves, sometimes vehemently, on account of our own differing backgrounds. Bulto and I are former pianists. Jesus and I are or were choir singers and sound engineers. Jesus is now a guitarist, while I'm a percussionist, and Bulto's primary musical activity is composition, and he does not publicly perform any instrument. I mostly play in theatres, while Jesus mostly plays in concert halls, and Bulto has, aside from playing roles up on stage, organised entire performances himself. I am habituated to ensemble performance, while Bulto is habituated to playing solo, and Jesus to a combination of both, so on and so forth. These differences of opinion are exactly illustrative of matters of fact we cannot rely upon to be consistent among other musicians or performers in general, and exploring our variant perspectives on the same notation is essential to agreeing on a standard interpretation amongst ourselves for the purposes of this work. For these reasons, even with the most detailed of scores, performing musicians and ensembles are invariably required to engage in a degree of interpretation, taking into account the context the work is from and the norms that then existed, along with their own judgments about what seems consistent and proper. Composing a playable score that matches one's intent is then largely about fabricating a representation that aligns well enough with each performer's expectations. This is as much about knowing one's performers and their expectations as it is to what lengths you will need to go to satisfy them. Mediating this is indeed the most important task of a good conductor, who is infinitely more valuable to an ensemble during rehearsals as a director of interpretation than as a mere timekeeper during performances. Indeed, a good conductor can often, by educated guesswork, make up for many of the shortfalls of unclear notation. However, often as not, these inclarities can also invite distortions of the underlying intent, and so it is usually better to give instructions that are as clear and unambiguous as possible to minimize the incidence of such misunderstandings. Our solution to this is twofold. On the one hand, the majority of our notation strays as little as possible into contentious or unclear territory, such as Baroque ornamentation, and is clear principally in virtue of simplicity. The other part, much more visibly, is the explicit invention and definition of novel notation, a practice that has become popular since the early 20th century. This allows us to step outside what is comfortable and unambiguous and make exacting indications for specific needs. Such inventions need to be explained somehow, which in Majora's score is the purpose of a glossary. The glossary is intended to descriptively clarify all the points of performance practice and some logistical considerations, as well as clearly explain all of the novel notation, such as recitativo meter and the chromatic mordents. This way, little is left to the background of the performers, who may not be the same performance to performance, and as much is confined to the stabler context of the work itself as possible. At length, to answer your question, music is a living tradition, and it is as valid that we write our own rulebook as it is that we follow anyone or everyone else's.